I'm entitled to half of everything, including that inheritance money, Jessica declared in the packed Denver courthouse, her voice dripping with confidence. 3 years of marriage gives me community property rights. The judge looked down at the stack of papers her attorney had just submitted, demanding $2. $1 million from my father's estate plus half my construction business. Jessica sat there in her $800 designer dress, the one she'd bought with my credit card last month, smiling like she'd already won the lottery. What she didn't know was that my father, Big Bob Carter, had been 10 steps ahead of her from the day we got engaged. My name is Tom Carter, I'm 47, and I run Carter Heavy Equipment Rentals here in Denver. Third generation, built from nothing by my grandfather in 1952. By the time I met Jessica 4 years ago at a business conference in Colorado Springs, we were pulling in solid 7 figures annually, renting everything from bulldozers to cranes across the Front Range. Jessica worked marketing for a tech startup then. Beautiful, smart, charming, had this way of making you feel like the most interesting guy in the room. She seemed genuinely impressed by what 3 generations of Carter men had built. When she moved in after 6 months, she fit right into my world. Supported me through Dad's cancer diagnosis, held my hand through every chemo appointment, cried with me at his funeral 2 years ago. I thought I'd found my partner for life. The warning signs started small. After Dad passed and I inherited his $4. $2 million estate, Jessica's spending habits changed overnight. Suddenly she needed designer everything: clothes, jewelry, spa treatments. Weekend trips to Aspen became monthly expectations. When I mentioned the bills, she'd get defensive. I'm supporting your career, Tom. This is what successful couples do. Dad had insisted on a prenup when we got engaged. It's not about love, son, he'd said in his quiet, measured way. It's about protecting what 3 generations built for the 4th. Jessica had resisted, calling it unromantic, but eventually signed after complaining she didn't even bother reading all that legal nonsense. What she definitely hadn't read, what nobody except Dad's attorney Frank Morrison and I knew, was the special clause Dad had buried in his will. A little insurance policy for exactly this situation. The inheritance wasn't actually mine yet. According to Dad's will, I could only claim the full $4. $2 million after 5 years of demonstrably happy marriage. But there was a trigger clause that would release the money immediately. If my spouse ever filed for divorce demanding a share of the inheritance itself, Dad had called it his greed detector. Sitting in that courtroom watching Jessica's attorney argue why she deserved millions she'd never earned, I couldn't help but smile. My father's wisdom was about to reach from beyond the grave and teach my wife the most expensive lesson of her life. Let me back up and tell you how I met the woman who tried to rob my family blind. It was November 2020 at a Colorado Construction Association conference in Colorado Springs. I was there presenting on equipment safety protocols when this stunning blonde approached me during the coffee break. Professional blazer, confident handshake, genuine interest in heavy machinery, not exactly common in the marketing crowd. Jessica Monroe, she introduced herself. I work for TechFlow Solutions, but I've always been fascinated by construction. My dad was a union electrician in Ohio. We talked for 2 hours. She asked intelligent questions about the business, seemed impressed by our family's 3-generation legacy. When I mentioned we'd started with just 2 bulldozers and a dream, she got this look in her eyes, like she was seeing something special. That's incredible, Tom. Building something that lasts, passing it down, that's real success. I was hooked. She moved to Denver a month later, claiming her company was expanding operations. Looking back, the timeline was awfully convenient. We dated for 6 months before she suggested moving in. She was attentive, supportive, made my house feel like a home for the first time since Mom passed. When Dad got his cancer diagnosis in early 2021, Jessica was a rock. Drove him to appointments when I couldn't get away from job sites. Sat with him during chemo sessions. Brought him homemade soup when he was too weak to eat much else. At his funeral, she held me while I cried and promised she'd help me honor his legacy. He raised an incredible man, she whispered. I'll spend my life proving I'm worthy of the Carter name. The proposal came naturally 8 months later. Dad was in remission then, still sharp as ever despite the treatments. When I told him I was ready to pop the question, his expression grew serious. Son, I need you to listen carefully. Get a prenuptial agreement. Dad, come on, Jessica's not like that. Maybe not, but you're about to inherit everything 3 generations of Carter men built. A prenup isn't about her character. It's about protecting the 4th generation. He was right, of course. When I brought it up, Jessica's reaction was telling. Are you kidding me, Tom? After everything we've been through, you want me to sign some contract saying I'm after your money? It's just standard protection, Jess. Frank Morrison handles all our legal stuff. He says anyone with significant assets should Frank Morrison doesn't love you. I do. This is insulting. The fight lasted 3 days. She threatened to call off the engagement twice. But eventually she agreed, mainly because Dad made it clear there wouldn't be a wedding without it. Fine, but I'm not reading 20 pages of legal garbage that basically says you don't trust me. She signed it without looking past the first page. The wedding was beautiful. Small ceremony at the Brown Palace downtown. Reception for family and close friends. Jessica looked radiant, played the perfect bride. During our vows, she promised to protect and honor the Carter legacy for generations to come. Dad pulled me aside during the reception. He looked tired. The cancer was winning by then, though we didn't know he only had 8 months left. I updated my will last week, he said quietly. Frank has the details. Just trust the process, son, no matter what happens. I didn't understand then. I thought he was just being overcautious, maybe a little paranoid from all the pain medication. But Big Bob Carter had built an empire by thinking 3 moves ahead of everyone else. Even on his deathbed, he was still protecting his family. Dad passed in March 2022, 8 months after our wedding. Lung cancer finally won the battle he'd fought so hard. I held his hand in those final moments, and his last words to me were, "Trust Frank. Follow the plan." The funeral was harder than I had expected. Losing the man who'd taught me everything about business, about life, about being a Carter. Jessica was amazing during those dark weeks, handled all the arrangements I couldn't face, coordinated with the minister, made sure Dad got the send-off he deserved. A week later, Frank Morrison called me into his office for the will reading. Just Jessica and me in his wood-paneled conference room, the same place where Dad had negotiated deals worth millions over the years. "Tom, your father has left you a substantial inheritance," Frank began, his voice carrying that formal tone lawyers use for important moments. The estate totals $4. $2 million real estate, investments, savings. However, there are specific conditions. I knew Dad had money saved, but $4. $2 million was more than I'd imagined. Jessica squeezed my hand, tears in her eyes. "What kind of conditions?" I asked. Frank adjusted his glasses, a gesture I'd seen him make 1,000 times when Dad was alive. "The inheritance becomes fully accessible after 5 years of demonstrably happy marriage. Until then, it remains in trust. However," he paused, glancing at Jessica, "there are circumstances under which the 5-year waiting period would be waived." "What circumstances?" Jessica asked, speaking up for the first time. "If the surviving spouse initiates divorce proceedings and specifically claims community property rights to the inheritance itself, the waiting period is immediately voided, and Tom gains full access to all funds." I didn't understand the significance then. It seemed like just another one of Dad's complicated business maneuvers. Jessica nodded along like it made perfect sense. "So basically, if I'm patient and faithful, I get the money in 5 years anyway?" I asked. "Precisely. Your father wanted to ensure the inheritance went to a man who'd built a stable, lasting marriage." Looking back, I should have paid more attention to Jessica's expression during that explanation. The way her eyes narrowed slightly when Frank mentioned the trigger clause. The questions she asked afterward about community property law in Colorado. But I was grieving, trying to keep the business running without Dad's guidance, dealing with insurance companies and estate attorneys. I missed the signs that Jessica was already calculating. The changes started immediately after the will reading. Small at first, Jessica began asking detailed questions about the business finances. Not supportive. "How was your day?" Questions, but specific inquiries about quarterly profits, equipment depreciation, client contracts. "I want to understand what we're building together," she'd say. "If I'm going to be a Carter wife, I should know how Carter money works." Her spending accelerated too. The grocery bills doubled as she bought expensive organic everything. Her spa treatments went from monthly to weekly. She joined an exclusive gym downtown that cost $300 a month. When I mentioned the increased expenses, she'd remind me about the inheritance. "We're going to be millionaires in 5 years, Tom. I'm just adjusting our lifestyle to match our future reality." Then came the bigger purchases. A $15,000 diamond bracelet for our first anniversary. A luxury SUV because my old car doesn't fit the image. Designer furniture to modernize the house Dad had built in 1985. The credit card statements grew thicker each month. Jessica always had explanations. She was networking at expensive restaurants to help my business, buying clothes for important industry events, investing in her appearance because successful men need wives who look the part. By our second anniversary, she'd racked up nearly $80,000 in charges. When I suggested maybe we should slow down the spending, her reaction was explosive. Are you kidding me, Tom? I gave up my career to support yours. I take care of this house. I attend every boring industry function. I smile and make small talk with your clients' wives. The least you can do is trust me with financial decisions. It's not about trust, Jess. It's about responsibility. We're spending money we don't actually have yet. We will have it. Your father's will guarantees that. Something about the way she said it, cold, calculated, sent a chill down my spine, like she was already thinking past our marriage to what came after. The third player in this drama lived 2 houses down from me. Derek Sullivan, 52, divorced contractor who'd moved into the neighborhood about 3 years ago. Nice enough guy on the surface. We'd chat over the fence occasionally. I'd lent him my trailer when he was moving furniture after his divorce. What I didn't know was that Derek had a very personal reason to hate the Carter family. It started in 2014 when Derek's construction company bid on a major city contract, $2, $8 million to replace aging water infrastructure in downtown Denver. Derek had leveraged everything for that job. His house, his business, his marriage. He was so confident he'd win that he'd already bought new equipment and hired additional crews. The contract went to Carter Heavy Equipment instead. Dad's bid came in lower, but more importantly, our safety record and equipment reliability were spotless. Derek's company had 3 OSHA violations the previous year and a history of cost overruns. The city made the smart choice, but Derek never saw it that way. Losing that contract bankrupted his business within 6 months. The dominoes fell fast after that. House went into foreclosure, wife filed for divorce, took half of what little remained. Derek blamed the Carter family for destroying his life, and 8 years later, he was still seething about it. When he moved into our neighborhood in 2021, right after Dad's funeral, I thought it was just coincidence. Denver's a big city, but the construction world is surprisingly small. I even felt bad for the guy, divorced, struggling, trying to rebuild. I went out of my way to be neighborly. Derek played his role perfectly. The grateful neighbor, the guy who'd learned from his mistakes, the divorced man just trying to start over. He'd come by occasionally for advice about home maintenance, always respectful, always appreciative of any help. But Derek Sullivan was playing a much longer game. He was watching, learning our routines, paying attention to Jessica's behavior, especially after Dad's inheritance kicked in. He noticed her spending sprees, her increasingly expensive taste, the way she talked about money when she thought no one was listening. Derek recognized something in Jessica that I was too blind to see. The same calculating greed that had destroyed his own marriage, but refined and patient. And he realized she could be the perfect weapon for his revenge against the Carter family. The first contact came about 6 months ago. Jessica was outside gardening when Derek approached with a bottle of wine and a sympathetic ear. I couldn't help but notice you seemed stressed lately, he told her. Divorce is tough. I've been through it myself. We're not divorced, Jessica corrected. Tom and I are happy. Of course. I just meant, well, marriage can be complicated when there's significant money involved. I learned that the hard way. From there, Derek began his careful cultivation. Casual conversations over the fence about difficult husbands who don't appreciate what they have. Stories about his own divorce, how his ex-wife fought for what she deserved. Suggestions about financial independence and women's rights in marriage. Jessica was receptive. More than receptive, she was hungry for validation of feelings she'd been hiding from me. Derek provided a sympathetic ear and, more importantly, practical advice from someone who'd navigated a high-stakes divorce. The key, Derek told her one evening in April, is documentation. You need to understand exactly what assets are involved, what your rights are, what strategies work best. He recommended his former divorce attorney, Linda Walsh, gave Jessica the name of the private investigator who'd worked his case, Marcus Webb, shared tactics about gathering financial information, building a case for maximum settlement. Derek wasn't just helping Jessica plan a divorce, he was weaponizing her against my family. Every piece of advice, every recommendation, every sympathetic conversation was designed to inflict maximum damage on the Carter legacy. The beautiful thing was, I had no idea. Derek maintained his friendly neighbor act perfectly. Still waved when he saw me, still asked to borrow tools occasionally. Even expressed concern when he noticed Jessica seemed a little distant lately. Hope everything's okay with you too, he'd say with perfect fake concern. Marriage can be tough, especially with business pressures. If only I'd known that my helpful neighbor was systematically dismantling my marriage from the inside, using my wife's own greed as the weapon. The discovery came by accident, like most betrayals do. It was a Tuesday afternoon in May. I'd come home early from a job site in Thornton because of equipment breakdown, expecting to find Jessica at her usual yoga class. Instead, I heard voices coming from our kitchen. The prenup might have a weakness regarding business appreciation, Jessica was saying. If I can prove my domestic support contributed to company growth during our marriage. I froze in the hallway, recognizing Derek's voice responding. Linda Walsh is the best divorce attorney in Colorado. She found exactly that angle in my case. The key is proving your non-financial contributions increase the business value. My stomach dropped. My wife was in my kitchen, plotting my financial destruction with my neighbor. What about the inheritance? Jessica asked. That's trickier. But Marcus Webb knows how to dig deep. He found assets my ex-wife thought she'd hidden, worth every penny of his $15,000 fee. $15,000 for a private investigator to destroy me. I backed out quietly, sat in my truck in the driveway for 20 minutes trying to process what I'd just heard. The woman I loved, the woman who'd held my hand at Dad's funeral, was actively working to rob me blind. That night I confronted her. Jess, we need to talk. About what? She was folding laundry, acting perfectly normal. About your conversation with Derek today. About divorce attorneys and private investigators. Her hands stopped moving. For just a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes. Tom, you're being paranoid. I heard you, Jessica. In our kitchen, planning how to take my inheritance. She sat down slowly, and I saw her mentally shifting gears, trying a different approach. Okay, yes, I've been talking to Derek about options, but not because I want a divorce, Tom. Because I'm scared. Scared of what? Of you. Of how you've changed since your father died. You're distant, suspicious, controlling about money. I consulted an attorney to understand my rights, to know where I stand if things get worse. It was masterful manipulation. Taking my discovery of her betrayal and flipping it into my fault, my problem, my failure as a husband. I'm not trying to hurt you, she continued, tears starting to flow. I just want to feel secure in our marriage. And here's the thing. I almost believed her. Almost. 3 weeks later, I got sick. Food poisoning, the kind that knocks you flat for days. I was practically helpless, running fever, could barely keep water down. Jessica transformed back into the woman I'd married, bringing me soup, checking my temperature, sleeping on the couch so I could rest better. I love you, Tom, she whispered one evening, sitting by my bedside. I know things have been tense lately, but we'll figure it out. We're Carters now. We stick together. For those 4 days, she was perfect. Attentive, caring, genuinely worried about my health. She even threw away some of her expensive purchases, saying she'd been too materialistic lately. As I recovered, doubt crept in. Had I misjudged her? Was Derek the real problem, poisoning her mind with his bitter divorce experience? Maybe Dad's elaborate will conditions were overkill, the paranoid creation of a dying man who'd spent too many years in cutthroat business negotiations. I started questioning everything. The prenup seemed harsh. The 5-year inheritance wait felt manipulative. Maybe Jessica deserved better than a husband who'd booby-trapped their marriage from day one. I called Frank Morrison, Dad's attorney, and asked him to meet for coffee. I'm thinking about modifying Dad's will, I told him at a Starbucks downtown. The conditions feel unfair to Jessica. Frank studied me over his coffee cup, the same intense look he'd given opposing counsel in countless negotiations. Tom, your father spent months crafting those conditions. He wasn't just protecting money, he was protecting you. From what? From my wife? From anyone who would see the Carter legacy as an opportunity rather than a responsibility. I laid out Jessica's recent behavior, her caring during my illness, my growing guilt about Dad's seemingly harsh conditions. Frank listened patiently, then leaned forward. Son, your father told me something before he died. He said the real test wouldn't be whether Jessica tried to take the money. It would be whether you were strong enough to let her. What do you mean? He knew you might have moments like this. Moments where love clouds judgment, where you'd want to believe the best despite evidence to the contrary. That's why the conditions are ironclad, to protect you from your own good heart. Frank pulled out a manila folder. Your father asked me to give you this if you ever wavered. He recorded it 2 weeks before he died. Inside was a USB drive labeled for Tom, when trust becomes dangerous. That evening, I sat alone in my home office and plugged in Dad's USB drive. A video file opened, showing my father sitting in the same chair just weeks before his death. He looked frail but alert, his voice still carrying that quiet authority I'd known my whole life. Tom, if you're watching this, it means you're having doubts about the inheritance conditions. That's natural, son. You've got a good heart, maybe too good for your own protection. Even on the screen, Dad's presence filled the room. I need to tell you something I never said while I was alive. I didn't trust Jessica from the beginning. Not because she was evil, but because she saw our family's success as an opportunity to be exploited rather than a legacy to be protected. My stomach clenched as he continued. I hired a private investigator 6 months after you started dating her. Background check, financial history, previous relationships. What I found wasn't criminal, but it was illuminating. Dad reached off camera and held up a folder. Jessica Monroe has a pattern, son. 3 previous relationships with financially successful men. Each relationship lasted just long enough to establish financial entanglement, then ended with her taking as much as possible. A banker in Ohio, she lived with him for 2 years, then sued him for palimony. A real estate developer in Phoenix, 6 months after their engagement ended, she was driving his BMW and living in an apartment he paid for. I felt sick. The woman I'd loved, trusted, married, she moved to Denver specifically to target you, Tom. The construction conference wasn't coincidence. She researched attendees, identified the most successful unmarried prospects. You were her primary target from day one. Dad leaned closer to the camera. The inheritance conditions aren't just about protecting money. They're about protecting you from someone who sees you as a transaction rather than a person. If Jessica truly loves you, she'll wait 5 years and be happy with whatever we build together. If she's what I think she is, she'll show her true colors the moment she realizes the inheritance is within reach. The video ended with Dad's final words. Trust the process, son. Let her reveal herself. I sat in the darkness for an hour, absorbing the implications. My marriage was built on deception. My wife was a professional predator, and my father had known all along. But Dad's conditions were brilliant in their simplicity. Jessica could have everything legitimately if she was patient and genuine. The only way she'd lose was if her greed overwhelmed her judgment. 2 weeks later, Jessica made her move. I came home to find her packing suitcases in our bedroom, designer clothes folded neatly, jewelry box already sealed shut. Going somewhere? I asked. She looked up with an expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculated, completely devoid of the warmth I'd fallen in love with. Tom, this isn't working. We want different things. Such as, I want a partner who trusts me, who treats me as an equal. You want a wife who'll wait around for 5 years hoping for scraps from your father's table. The mask was finally off. I've consulted with an attorney, she continued. Linda Walsh. She believes I have excellent grounds for claiming half the marital assets, including a portion of your inheritance. The inheritance isn't marital property, Jess. The prenup has weaknesses. My attorney found case law suggesting that domestic support during marriage can create claims on previously separate assets, especially if those assets appreciated due to the supported spouse's business success. She was reciting legal arguments like she'd memorized them. Derek's coaching had been thorough. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow, she announced. This doesn't have to be ugly, Tom. Give me what I deserve, half of everything, including half that inheritance, and we can both move on with our lives. I almost laughed. Almost. Jessica had just triggered the exact conditions Dad had predicted, the precise scenario that would activate his trap. We'll let the lawyers figure out what you deserve, I said. Jessica smiled that cold, calculating smile. My attorney says Colorado is a community property state. 3 years of marriage, significant assets acquired during that time, documented domestic support contributing to business success. The math is simple, Tom. What Jessica didn't understand was that the math had already been done by a man who'd spent 40 years outmaneuvering people just like her. She moved out that weekend, confident in her coming victory. Through Derek, she'd hired Marcus Webb, the private investigator who produced a comprehensive report on my assets, the business valuation, real estate holdings, investment accounts, and especially the $4. $2 million inheritance. Jessica's legal team had done their homework. They'd found the potential weakness in the prenup, researched community property precedents, calculated their maximum demand. What they didn't know was that all their research, all their strategy, all their careful planning had just handed me the ultimate victory. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning. Jessica was demanding 50% of all marital assets, including what her attorney called community interest in inherited property due to spousal support contributing to asset preservation and growth during marriage. In plain English, she wanted $2, $1 million of Dad's money. Frank Morrison called me within an hour of receiving his copy. Tom, congratulations. Jessica just activated your father's inheritance clause. What exactly does that mean? It means you now have full, immediate access to the $4. $2 million with no waiting period. By demanding a share of the inheritance in divorce proceedings, Jessica triggered the exact condition your father specified for immediate distribution. I sat down hard. Dad's trap had worked perfectly. But there's more, Frank continued. I need you to come in tomorrow. We have some preparation to do before the court date. At Frank's office the next morning, he spread out documents across his conference table like a general planning a battle. Jessica's attorney, Linda Walsh, is good. She found the potential weakness in your prenup. The argument that spousal support during marriage can create community interest in separate property that appreciates in value. Is that a real threat? Frank smiled grimly. Under normal circumstances, possibly. There's Colorado case law that supports her argument. But Jessica made a crucial error. He pulled out a thick folder labeled Private Investigation Report, Marcus Webb. Jessica hired Webb to document your assets for the divorce. She paid him $15,000 to prove her case. What she didn't realize is that everything Webb documented becomes evidence in the proceedings. Frank opened the report. Page after page of financial details, property values, business assessments, all of it compiled by Jessica's own investigator. Here's the beautiful irony, Tom. Webb's report actually helps us. Look at page 43. I read the highlighted section. Subject's business showed minimal growth during marriage period, 2021 to 2024. Revenue declined 12% in 2023 due to equipment failures and increased competition. No evidence that domestic spousal support contributed to business value preservation. Jessica paid $15,000 for a report that destroys her own legal argument, Frank observed. Webb concluded that not only didn't her spousal support help the business grow, the business actually declined in value during your marriage. But there was more. Derek Sullivan made a mistake too. He referred Jessica to his divorce team, Walsh and Webb. But Derek's divorce case was public record. I pulled the files yesterday. Frank handed me another folder. Derek's 2018 divorce showed a pattern of deception, hidden assets, and financial manipulation that had ultimately backfired on him spectacularly. Derek lost everything because he got too greedy, tried to hide assets from his ex-wife, and ended up in contempt of court. Now he's coaching Jessica to make the same mistakes. Walsh is using the same strategies that failed in Derek's case. The picture was becoming clear. Jessica had surrounded herself with advisors whose previous case was a spectacular failure, and she'd hired an investigator who'd accidentally proven she had no legal claim to my inheritance. What's our strategy? I asked. Frank leaned back in his chair. We're going to give Jessica exactly what she asked for, a full legal proceeding where all the evidence gets presented. The prenup, your father's will, Webb's investigative report, Derek's involvement, Jessica's spending patterns, everything. Over the next week, Frank assembled our case like a master craftsman. He subpoenaed Jessica's financial records, which showed the $80,000 in credit card debt she'd accumulated. He documented her consultations with multiple divorce attorneys, proving premeditation. He even found text messages between Jessica and Derek discussing strategy. The key, Frank explained, is that Jessica has to prove two things to break the prenup. First, that her domestic support contributed to business growth during marriage. And second, that the inheritance should be considered marital property despite being explicitly excluded in your prenuptial agreement. Can she prove either? Not only can't she prove them, her own evidence disproves them. Webb's report shows the business declined during your marriage, contradicting any claim that her support helped it grow. And by demanding the inheritance in divorce proceedings, she triggered your father's clause, making it permanently and irrevocably separate property. Frank pulled out one final document. Your father left a letter to be read in court if this situation ever arose. Would you like to read it first? The letter was 2 pages, written in Dad's careful handwriting. To any court considering my son's divorce proceedings, the inheritance conditions in my will were designed specifically to distinguish between a spouse who genuinely loves my son and one who sees him as a financial opportunity. Any spouse who truly cares for Tom's well-being would never jeopardize his financial security by demanding a share of inheritance meant to protect our family legacy. The act of making such a demand reveals the demandant's true character and automatically disqualifies them from any benefit. This inheritance was earned through 3 generations of honest work and should only pass to those who understand its purpose, protecting the 4th generation and beyond. I looked up at Frank. He really did think of everything. Your father spent 40 years dealing with people who wanted what he'd built without earning it. Jessica never stood a chance. The court date was set for the following Monday. Jessica's attorney had requested an expedited hearing, confident in their case. They had no idea they were walking into a trap 40 years in the making. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, typical November weather in Denver. I sat in the courthouse parking lot for 10 minutes, watching Jessica and her legal team walk up the steps. She wore that navy blue dress again, the expensive one, and carried herself with complete confidence. Derek Sullivan sat in the back row when I entered the courtroom, wearing a suit I'd never seen before. He nodded at me like we were still friendly neighbors, like he hadn't spent months coaching my wife to destroy me financially. Judge Patricia Williams called the court to order at 9 a.m. sharp. She was known for running efficient proceedings and having little patience for legal theatrics. Linda Walsh, Jessica's attorney, stood to deliver her opening statement. She was everything Derek had promised: sharp, experienced, confident. Your Honor, this is a straightforward case of community property division. Mrs. Carter sacrificed her career to support her husband's business endeavors. During their 3-year marriage, she provided domestic support that directly contributed to the preservation and growth of marital assets, including inherited property that appreciated in value due to her contributions. Jessica nodded along, playing the role of wronged wife perfectly. Mrs. Carter is entitled to half of all marital property, including community interest in the inherited estate that benefited from her support. We're requesting $2. $1 million from the inheritance, plus half of all other marital assets and reasonable spousal support. Walsh gestured toward a stack of documents. We have comprehensive evidence of asset values, business growth patterns, and Mrs. Carter's substantial non-financial contributions to the marriage. Judge Williams listened impassively, then turned to Frank Morrison. Counsel for the defendant? Frank stood slowly, carrying only a thin manila folder. Your Honor, the plaintiff has indeed provided comprehensive evidence. Unfortunately for her case, that evidence proves she has no legal claim whatsoever to any portion of my client's inheritance. He opened the folder and removed 2 documents. I'd like to present these items for the court's review. First, the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties, explicitly excluding all inherited property from community assets. Judge Williams accepted the document, scanning the relevant sections. Second, Frank continued, the last will and testament of Robert Carter, Mr. Carter's deceased father, containing specific conditions regarding inheritance distribution. The judge's eyebrows rose as she read the will. I watched her expression change from professional neutrality to something approaching amazement. Mr. Morrison, she said slowly, am I reading this correctly? The inheritance was conditional upon the marriage lasting 5 years without divorce proceedings claiming community property in the inherited assets? That is correct, Your Honor. By filing for divorce and specifically demanding a share of the inheritance, Mrs. Carter has triggered the clause that immediately transfers all inherited property to my client as separate, non-marital assets. The courtroom erupted. Jessica's face went white as she realized what had just happened. Walsh was frantically flipping through her own copies of the documents, trying to understand how she'd missed this. Furthermore, Frank continued, I'd like to present evidence that Mrs. Carter's claim of contributing to business growth is contradicted by her own investigative report. He handed Judge Williams the private investigator's findings. Mrs. Carter paid $15,000 for Marcus Webb to document my client's assets. Mr. Webb's own conclusions state that the business declined in value during the marriage, and that there's no evidence spousal support contributed to asset preservation. Judge Williams read Webb's report, shaking her head slightly. So the plaintiff hired an investigator who disproved her own case? Essentially, yes, Your Honor. Jessica was whispering urgently to Linda Walsh, who looked like she wanted to disappear. In the back row, Derek Sullivan had gone pale. Judge Williams set down the documents and removed her glasses, studying Jessica with an expression that could freeze water. Mrs. Carter, she began, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench. Let me make sure I understand your position. You hired a private investigator to catalog your husband's assets for divorce proceedings. You consulted with multiple attorneys about maximizing your settlement. And you specifically demanded half of an inheritance that was explicitly excluded from marital property in a prenuptial agreement you signed. Jessica tried to respond, but the judge held up her hand. More importantly, you made this demand knowing that your father-in-law had structured his will to test exactly this scenario. By claiming community property rights to inherited assets, you triggered a clause that permanently removes any possibility of your benefiting from that inheritance. Your Honor, Linda Walsh interrupted, We'd like to challenge the validity of both the prenuptial agreement and the inheritance conditions on grounds of unconscionability. Judge Williams turned her attention to Jessica's attorney with barely concealed irritation. Counselor, your client was represented by independent legal counsel when she signed the prenuptial agreement. She had every opportunity to negotiate terms or refuse to sign. The inheritance conditions are equally clear and were established by the deceased's right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. Frank Morrison stood. Your Honor, I have one additional piece of evidence. A letter from the deceased to be read in precisely these circumstances. He handed her Dad's final letter. Judge Williams read it silently, and I saw something that might have been respect cross her features. This is remarkable, she said quietly. Then louder, the court finds that Mrs. Carter's demand for inherited property has activated the testamentary conditions established by Robert Carter. The prenuptial agreement is valid and enforceable. Mrs. Carter has no claim to inherited assets, business property acquired before marriage, or any assets specifically excluded in the prenuptial agreement. Jessica made a sound like she'd been physically struck. Furthermore, the judge continued, the court notes with displeasure the calculated nature of Mrs. Carter's actions. The evidence shows clear premeditation, multiple attorney consultations, private investigation services, strategic coordination with advisors. This appears less like a marriage dissolution than a planned financial extraction. Judge Williams looked directly at Jessica. Mrs. Carter, you are entitled to half of assets acquired during the marriage minus debts incurred. Based on the evidence presented, that amounts to approximately $23,000 in joint savings, offset by $80,000 in credit card debt accumulated solely by you. The math was devastating. After 3 years of marriage and months of scheming, Jessica would walk away owing $57,000. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with the finality of a coffin lid. Jessica sat frozen as the courtroom emptied. I saw Derek Sullivan slip out the back exit, probably realizing his role in this disaster was about to become very public knowledge. Frank gathered his documents with the satisfaction of a master craftsman completing his finest work. Your father would be proud, he told me as we walked to the parking lot. That evening, I sat in Dad's old chair in my home office, looking out at the mountains he'd loved. The inheritance was officially mine, $4. $2 million that would secure Carter heavy equipment for another generation. But more than that, I had the knowledge that my father's wisdom had protected me from the most expensive mistake of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. This isn't over, Tom. I'm appealing. I showed the message to Frank the next day. He chuckled. Let her try. Appeals require legal grounds, and she has none. Plus, appeals cost money she doesn't have. He was right. Jessica's legal fund was exhausted. Her credit cards maxed out. Her financial future destroyed. Within 6 months, she'd declared bankruptcy and left Colorado entirely. Derek Sullivan moved away 2 weeks after the court hearing, quietly putting his house on the market and disappearing. I heard through industry contacts that word had spread about his role in coaching divorce fraud. In Denver's tight-knit construction community, that kind of reputation follows you forever. As for me, I used part of the inheritance to expand Carter Heavy Equipment, buying newer equipment and hiring additional crews. Business boomed as word spread about the company's financial stability and long-term thinking. But the best investment I made was in legal education programs for small business owners, teaching them about asset protection and the importance of careful estate planning. Dad's wisdom shouldn't die with his generation. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't what you do to your enemies. It's what you build despite their attempts to tear you down. 3 years have passed since that November morning in Denver District Court. Carter Heavy Equipment now employs 43 people and operates across 4 states. The inheritance Dad left me has grown to over $6 million through careful investment and business expansion. But the real value wasn't in the money, it was in the lesson. I keep Dad's final letter framed in my office now, next to a photo of him standing beside our first bulldozer in 1987. Visitors often ask about it, and I tell them the story. Not the whole story. Some details are too personal, but the essential truth. My father protected his family's legacy by understanding human nature better than the people trying to exploit it. Frank Morrison retired last year, but not before helping me establish the Carter Family Foundation. We provide legal education scholarships for small business owners, focusing on asset protection and estate planning. Every year we fund seminars across Colorado teaching entrepreneurs how to protect what they've built from exactly the kind of predators Jessica represented. Your father's wisdom shouldn't die with one generation, Frank told me at his retirement party. The best way to honor his memory is making sure other families don't face what you did. Jessica never did appeal the divorce decree. Her bankruptcy was finalized 8 months after the trial, and she left Colorado entirely. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she moved back to Ohio, working retail and living with her parents. The professional gold-digging career was over. Word travels fast in certain circles, and no successful man wants to date someone with her courtroom history. Derek Sullivan's exit from Denver was even more complete. His house sold below market value, and he moved to somewhere in Arizona, far from Colorado's construction industry. His role in the divorce conspiracy had become public knowledge, destroying what remained of his professional reputation. The irony isn't lost on me. Derek's hatred of my family, his need for revenge over a contract he'd lost fairly, ultimately gave me the evidence I needed to expose Jessica's true nature. His bitter expertise in divorce tactics became the very weapon that destroyed her case. Sometimes your enemies defeat themselves if you're patient enough to let them. I never remarried. After Jessica, trust doesn't come easily. But I've dated carefully with the wisdom that comes from learning the hard way how some people view successful men. Dad's lessons about protecting the family legacy extend beyond just legal documents. They're about understanding character, recognizing genuine partnership versus calculated opportunity. The construction business has been good to the Carter family for 70 years now. We've weathered economic downturns, industry changes, and personal betrayals. We've survived because each generation learned to distinguish between people who wanted to build something with us and people who just wanted what we'd already built. Last month, I hired a new project manager, a smart young woman with an engineering degree and genuine passion for construction. She reminds me a little of how Jessica seemed when we first met. Intelligent, ambitious, interested in the business. The difference is in the details. This woman asks about equipment maintenance schedules and safety protocols. Jessica asked about revenue streams and asset valuations. I've learned to listen for the difference. Frank Morrison's replacement, a sharp young attorney named Sarah Chen, helped me update my own will recently. Following Dad's example, I've structured my estate to protect against the kind of predators who see family wealth as an opportunity to be exploited rather than a legacy to be preserved. The conditions are different, more sophisticated, adapted to modern financial structures, but the principle remains the same. True partners build together. False ones reveal themselves when they try to take what they haven't earned. Some people call this paranoid. They say such elaborate protections show a lack of trust in humanity. Maybe they're right. But after watching Jessica's calculated performance, Derek's bitter manipulation, and the systematic way they tried to dismantle 3 generations of honest work, I'd rather be paranoid than bankrupt. Dad's grave sits on a hill overlooking Denver, with a view of the mountains he loved and the city where he built his legacy. I visit every month, usually on Sunday mornings when the cemetery is quiet and I can think clearly. "Thanks, Dad," I tell him every time. The plan worked perfectly. The inscription on his headstone reads, "Robert Carter. He built well and protected what he built." It doesn't mention the money, the business success, or the elaborate legal strategies. It doesn't need to. The people who matter understand that the greatest wealth isn't what you accumulate. It's what you preserve for the people who come after you. And sometimes, protecting your legacy means being smart enough to let greedy people defeat themselves. The father's will wasn't just a legal document. It was a masterclass in understanding human nature delivered from beyond the grave by a man who'd spent his lifetime learning the difference between people worth trusting and people who see trust as weakness to be exploited. That might be the most valuable inheritance of all.